Hi everyone, I'm Maryam, and I'm so pleased and honoured and excited to have been selected as one of this year's speakers at the North American Conference. So when I think of Pym, I think of her many unmarried female characters. I think of her excellent women, her spinsters, be they 28 and working office jobs in the city, or be they 50 and doing parish work in the countryside. In any case, Pym has written so many diverse and intriguing and complex unmarried female characters with rich inner lives at a time when marriage was really the crowning achievement in any woman's career. A Glass of Blessings then stands out because that is one of the few Pym novels with a married heroine. Wilmot Forsythe is pretty, she is married, and she is financially comfortable. Few of Pym's heroines possess any of these qualities, perhaps one, but not more than that. And perhaps most significantly, she also transgresses the boundaries of sexual propriety, which again, Pym's heroines very rarely do by conducting an extramarital affair outside of her marriage. So whilst Wilmot's character type is quite out of the ordinary for Pym, she isn't out of the ordinary for British post-war fiction in general. For example, there is Terence Rattigan's play The Deep Blue Sea from the early 50s about Hester Collier, a barrister's wife who leaves her husband for a former RAF pilot. And then there's perhaps most famously David Lean's Brief Encounter from 1945 about Laura Jessen, a wife and a mother who also conducts an extramarital affair outside of her marriage. And Lean would go on to make The Passionate Friends 4 years later, in 1949, a film that is almost identical to Brief Encounter. So I find it quite fascinating that some of the most enduringly popular, enduringly affecting stories of women from the British post-war are about unfaithful women. Brief Encounter, for example, continues to be considered one of the masterpieces of cinema, and The Deep Blue Sea has been quite recently been adapted into a film by Terence Davies. Beautiful, I can only recommend it. And it is fascinating to me because this character type is so contrary to what we would perhaps imagine the typical post-war woman to be, the 1950s woman to be. And that cultural image is quite strong. Perhaps we imagine her wearing pink or red lipstick and big bustling skirts. Perhaps she's making strange concoctions set in aspic and raising the children dutifully. And most importantly, she's utterly faithful to her husband. And that is going to be the topic of my talk. Infidelity, marriage, attempting adultery in Barbara Pym's A Glass of Blessings. Why has Pym picked this topic? How does she treat this topic? What is she saying about marriage, about infidelity? She, who usually focuses on unmarried female characters. And in order to properly answer this question, or these questions, or perhaps thoroughly answer them, one would have to first look at the cultural climate that this book was emerged from, and that is the post-war. As the name already suggests, post-war is after the war. It is peace, but a war as tragic and destructive as it is, of course, leaves its marks well into the post-war era. There's the trauma, the psychological effects, the bombed cityscapes, which very tangibly, very visually represent the destruction of the war. And perhaps less tragically, but still very prominently, there is food rationing, especially in Britain, where rationing ended in 1954, almost a full decade after the war itself had ended. So naturally, the desire to return to peace and order and normal life was quite strong. And how does one reinstate peace and order and normality at a society-wide level, at a nation-wide level? By reinstating it within the smallest social unit, the nuclear family. The nuclear family also emerged as a contradiction, as a response to the muddled sexual politics of the war. For example, 1/3 of all babies born between 1940 and 1945 in Britain were born out of wedlock, which is a huge number for the first half of the 20th century. And whilst there were 10,000 divorce petitions in 1938, there were 25,000 in 1945. That pre-war number then almost tripled. The strengthening economy also allowed families to get by on a single income, the husband's income. And this furthered a labor divide, a gendered divide in tasks, according to which the man, the husband, would go off to work, make money, whilst his wife would be the homemaker, bear children, and raise them too. Beaumont writes that the desire for a return to normal family life after the disruption of the war meant that married life and motherhood was scrutinized like never before. And that is really how the image of the dutiful 1950s housewife was born. And it's quite a narrow image of womanhood, quite a strict and rigid conception of it. And that is a double source of pressure. Of course, on the one hand, there is the matter of coping with the aftermath of the war, which concerns everyone. But there is also more, on a more gendered level, the conformity or non-conformity to new strict conceptions of womanhood, which are so contrary to what women had been doing before, just a few years, and that is working in the war service, in factories, and so on. And Pym, in my opinion, investigates this in pretty much all of her novels, especially in her single characters. Tinknell, for example, writes that Pym spinsters in particular are acutely conscious of their exclusion from the socially normative model of post-war femininity, the housewife and the mother, and Ackley writes that Pym's heroines, especially, are conscious of their distance from others, feeling displaced, not firmly tied to one human being. They live alone and occupy themselves with thoughts of establishing relationships which will give some sort of meaning to their lives. None of them wants to be considered useless, unloved, or unlovable. All around them are signs of disturbing changes in post-war England, which reinforce the sense of isolation and fragmentation. So if Pym has so thoroughly investigated this climate through her single characters, within her single characters, what happens then when she does so through the character of a married woman who, superficially, of course, does conform? Of course, Wilmot does not exactly conform, because we know her. We know that she conducts an extramarital affair and thus crosses into the territory of infidelity. Wilmot, however, is not Pym's first exploration of unfaithful married womanhood. There is perhaps more, not prominently, but she came first, Helena Napier from Excellent Women. To me, she's quite an obvious parallel to Wilmot. She is to her as Miss Bingley or Mary Crawford are to Emma Woodhouse. In fact, Mary Beamish is a much more typical, traditional Pym heroine, in the same way that Jane Fairfax is a much more typical Austen heroine. We know that Helena's marriage is troubled, that she falls in love with her colleague Everett Bone, and the topic of divorce is actually on the table. She even moves out briefly out of the flat. However, being cold towards Mildred, the narrator, as she is, we never really get to see her side of the story. Helena admittedly has been hiding her feelings for Everett Bone quite poorly, and it's quite an unseemly way of carrying on. And whilst Mildred, they have very similar names, watches events unfold with her usual detached manner, this chain of events really does nothing to sway her already low opinion of Helena, who, although not very active within the novel, looms over the story as a sort of menacing presence. She's beautiful, she's married, she's educated, she is an academic, and she's working. And she is of unseemly sexual appetite. By being so publicly and openly unhappy within her marriage, she implicitly deconstructs it, she implicitly criticizes it as that construct that is supposed to be a woman's ultimate happiness. She's a contradiction of a woman. She's a frighteningly modern one, who is both something she should and should not be. And Mildred, then, who is perfectly comfortable indulging Rocky Napier's inappropriate attempts at emotional intimacy with her, cannot tolerate the same within his wife. So I think it really speaks to Pym's range, then, that she has taken this character type and an antagonist, a sort of antagonist in this novel, and made her a protagonist, which really allows for deeper, more thorough exploration. And as I have already mentioned, Helena's story is a deconstruction of marriage. Although she returns to Rocky eventually, their marriage is not a happy one. It is not an aspirational one. Wilmot is pretty and married and pretty much content. She actually likes the people she surrounds herself with, which again is quite different from characters such as Mildred Lathbury or Belinda Bede, who seek community, a lot of community, with people they do not really seem to be able to stand for some reason. And unlike these two characters, she's not prone to constant introspection, which goes for Jane Cleveland as well, one of Pym's very few married heroines who, nonetheless, is quite self-conscious. But Wilmot is not entirely happy, as very few Pym characters are. She is prone to nostalgia, specifically her days in the war service, when she was a Wren officer stationed in Italy, and she remembers that time quite fondly. She remembers the beautiful landscapes, the fantastic food, and the messy courtship, the joy of being courted by several men at once, and perhaps also the implied sexual freedom of those days. Now she's a respectable wife, and she has been so for almost 15 years. And ironically, then, what any excellent woman would consider the high point in her life, Wilmot has already surpassed in her teenage years, and she is subconsciously, constantly chasing that feeling. And that is problematic because her life really is marked by stagnation. She gave up her carefree teenage existence for married respectability in the blink of an eye. There really was no time for her to grow into this new role. And her life has barely changed since. She does not work or volunteer or raise children or keep the house. And I'm not saying she should do these things. I'm merely saying that these are activities that would occupy a married peer of hers pretty much constantly. Her life then pretty much only consists of church and restaurant visits, and she has no real goals either or purpose. As a Wren officer, there was the war service, there was victory to work towards too, and now she feels particularly useless in the presence of people such as Mary Beamish, and for the rest of the time she just suppresses that feeling. And Rodney, her husband, does nothing much to contribute to any sort of excitement in her life. He is a nice but dull civil servant, quite different from what Wilmot, the teenager, imagined him to be. We know practically nothing about him, which is quite curious because Pym, of course, is no stranger to painting a very clear picture with few brushstrokes, as it were. But Rodney remains hazy, he remains blurry around the edges. And I, during reading, sometimes even forgot he was there, that Wilmot is in fact married, that he's married to this man, to Rodney. And he only takes on some shape, so to speak, at the very end of the novel, when he opens up to Wilmot, finally. And that is probably what causes Hannah Rosefield to call Wilmot a married spinster. Jane Cleveland, that is, and Wilmot are married spinsters, she says. Their minds slide off housework into poetry or fantasy. They're fond of their husbands, but they live their inner lives alone. And Barbara Brother says that if the women in Pym's novels do marry, their husbands are neither passionate nor profound, neither great lovers nor great thinkers. And Ackley writes that Wilmot is an illustration of the fact that a full life, as it is defined in Excellent Women, does not magically and immediately follow marriage. The status that Pym's plain, excellent women lack does not guarantee a sense of personal fulfillment. So basically, Wilmot is married, but emotionally, there is nothing really there to suggest that she is. Pym spinsters always look at marriage or partnership as an ultimate source of emotional fulfillment, but Wilma does not get this. She does not have this in her life. So her life is stagnating. She is quite distant from her husband, and although she's not conscious of it, she needs distraction, and she's looking for distraction. And she finds this in Piers Longbridge, who is handsome and bohemian and an alcoholic, and thus very exciting and excitingly different from everything that Rodney is and stands for. He bestows attention on Wilmot, which probably reminds her of her days of being courted, but he also keeps an aura of mystery about him. He is an enigma in some way, and that also keeps him interesting. And he's different not only from Rodney, but all other male characters in the novel. He is different from he is different from Pym's clergymen, who are utterly proper. He is different from Harry, Rowena's husband, who's loud and sleazy and arrogant, and in my opinion, one of Pym's most vile creations in his realism. He's unfortunately quite realistic. And his dislike of Piers can be read as homophobic, and he has absolutely no problem cheating on his wife, or at least trying to, with their best friend. There's another scene where Rodney invites his colleague to dinner, who excuses his wife's absence by saying that she has just had a child in such a strangely detached manner, as if it were not his child as well. And subconsciously then, Wilmot is probably quite tired of this type of man. She comments on the following on Rowena's marriage. Harry was one of those non-intellectual men who are often more comforting to women than the exciting but tortured intellectuals, which is quite ironic because that is exactly what Piers is. He might not have any very interesting conversation for his wife at the end of the day, might indeed quite easily drop off after dinner, but he was strong and reliable, assuming that he would be the breadwinner, and his wife would of course vote the same way as he did. And there we have Pym's famous scathing tongue and wit, but Wilmot herself, the narrator, a married woman, is critical of this norm, of this division, this dichotomy. Presumably she reserves the right to vote any way she likes, no matter what Rodney has to say about it. And Pierce's appeal then is his total lack of middle-class indifference or entitlement or machismo. As Brothers puts it, he is a perfect romantic subject, brilliant but unsuccessful, a handsome man with a Byronic touch. What better vehicle for a woman's desire to be needed, to do some good, and to escape from the mundaneness of her life? Still, why does Wilma do it? Why does she engage in the affair? Why does she risk the social ramifications, the legal ramifications of being discovered? And I think one of the reasons is the implied freedom in an affair. Attraction between men and women is rarely just that. It more often than not comes with a specific set of rules. There's rules for courtship, consummation, cohabitation, procreation, which may all differ culturally, but are there nonetheless. And non-compliance would historically been punished legally or socially, and women would bear the brunt of this. And in the 1950s, attraction between women and men is legally sanctioned within the context of marriage. And as we've already discussed, a married woman is not just a woman who is married, she is a wife, and being a wife is a role, a performance that does not respect the individual's choices or wants, needs, interests, likes, dislikes. And the appeal, and a husband might be expected legally, logically, socially, to want his wife to perform these activities, these actions, these roles for him. But an affair partner cannot do that. Of course he can, but there is no legal system to support him in this. He cannot make those demands of her. He cannot ask a woman to raise his children. And perhaps most significantly, one can always exit an affair at any time. And of course, this is not the case for marriage, nowhere on the planet, but divorce is a bit harder to obtain in England than perhaps here in Germany. We have a no-fault divorce system, but England has a fault-based divorce system, meaning that there have to be some sort of grounds for a divorce. Evidently, then, there is quite a unique appeal in a divorce for women, and perhaps it is not the same for men. And Pym does write her unfaithful female and male characters quite differently. When you think of infidelity, we probably think of a man. There's this stereotype, this cliche of a man, of a middle-aged man in a midlife crisis, which just so happens to coincide with an affair with a much younger woman. Film and television and literature certainly tend to suggest so. And A Glass of Blessings features two men who do sort of fit this description, Harry and perhaps more surprisingly Rodney. There's other Pym characters who, male characters who are also unfaithful. For example, Crampton Hotnet's Francis, who has a very awkward emotional affair with his female student. All of Pym's middle-aged men then who are unfaithful do conform to the stereotype, and she has very little compassion for them. These men cheat because they have the opportunity to, not for any other deeper psychological reason. And more interestingly, they do not exactly feel guilty, whereas unfaithful women are in much greater psychological trauma. They can suppress the guilt, but it often comes out. And the only man Pym withholds her cynicism from amongst these three, is Rodney, who confesses to having had dinner with Prudence Bates. And when Wilma counters that she has had lunch with Pierce and Harry, he says that dinner is rather different somehow. He claims that dinner is really all that this affair, or well, this friendship amounted to, but he betrays himself when he admits to having seen Prudence's famous Regency furnished flat. So perhaps dinner is a euphemism here. Perhaps he has physically betrayed Wilmot. So if he has, why has Wilmot not made the same leap? Of course, Piers is gay, probably. I personally am not quite sure. I think there is an ambiguity there that just adds to the appeal of the novel. At times he does seem interested to me. I don't know. I think this is really not up to any of us to judge. But of course, there's a reason why Pym wrote him the way he is, why there is a barrier between him and Wilmot. And this is also a matter of era. A Glass of Blessings was published in 1958, which makes it still firmly embedded in this post-war conservatism, but the changes of the 1960s are already looming on the horizon. Pugh says that by the 1950s, it was hard to escape the conclusion that the movement, the feminist movement, had suffered an inexorable decline, and some historians have gone so far as to suggest that feminism had virtually ceased to exist as a result of the combined effects of the Depression and the Second World War. This would all change gradually with the advent of the contraceptive pill, which both gave rise to the so-called sexual revolution and also the second feminist movement in a way. And this also opened up conversations and dialogues about non-monogamy, extramarital relations, and so on. Before that, cheating or non-monogamy was much more risky for women, not only socially, but also physically, biologically, because a man could, in case of his affair partner's pregnancy, just remove himself from the situation, whereas an adulterous woman couldn't really. Even if she got an abortion, for example, there's still sort of this physical manifestation of her unfaithfulness. And there are many stories of unmarried women having children with unmarried men from post-war Britain, all published around the late 50s and early 60s. For example, A Taste of Honey, The L-Shaped Room, and The Millstone, all of which I can only recommend, all written by women. And they all argue for the innocence of unmarried mothers. And that is much more easily done, since unmarried mothers do not really hurt anyone, but a married woman's extramarital affair, a pregnancy, is much more loaded in a way, because it is a physical sign of her betrayal. And one can see then why a writer like Pym, who very successfully avoids the melodramatic, would not want to write about such a topic. Wilmot forgives Rodney for whatever vague transgression of his, but would he forgive the same in her then, is the question. Perhaps he would, as he has noticed that married life has not improved for Wilmot, as he says, this last year or two, and blames himself and his infatuation with Prudence Bates for it. So perhaps he could understand if Wilmot physically betrayed him. But the question is also, would we as readers Would readers in 1958 understand? Publishers? Probably not. The problem then is twofold, but intertwined in order to get back to Wilmot herself. What is she to do? It appears to be a quite hopeless situation. But is it really? As I mentioned, the problem is intertwined. It is a consequence. One is the consequence of the other. Wilmot is lonely. Her existence is inert because she is married. She has nothing really to work towards, to work for, to exist for in a way. She has no real future to look forward to anymore. And her life is routine, is just existing. It's not really doing. And that is also quite similar to Laura Jessen in Brief Encounter, whose life is painfully dominated by routine, and the most excitement she gets in her life is once a week when she goes out to shop in the city. The rest of her days she spends raising her children and listening to her husband do boring crossword puzzles. And that too is a deconstruction of marriage, because it asks the question, where is the room for personal fulfillment, for growth and goals? What does society allot to married women in terms of opportunities? Wilmot, who's not consciously aware of this, but subconsciously very much so, copes not only by having this emotional affair with peers, but also by surrounding herself with people in whom she senses a similar stagnation, a similar lack of something. For example, there is Sybil, her mother-in-law, who is elderly and widowed, and Mary Beamish, who is of Wilmot's age, but she is much less pretty. She has presumably no sexual experience, and she's codependent with her controlling mother. And Piers also fits this description. He works dead-end jobs, he's an alcoholic, there is no real future for him. And as long as these people's lives are stagnant as hers, but superficially much less desirable, Wilmot can feel better, she can cope with her inert existence, and she does not really have to face her life for what it is. It is lacking. But this also causes her to conceptualize people only in relation to herself, and she struggles to see their identity untethered from her. For example, her blindness to Sybil's fondness of Professor Root is almost comical. Sybil, to be Professor Root's wife, she ponders. But she was Rodney's mother and my mother-in-law. How could she ever be anything else? And when she goes to visit Mary, who of course is engaged herself without Wilmot's knowing, they have the following exchange. I had been telling her about Sybil's forthcoming marriage and what an upheaval it was going to make in our lives. Yes, Mary said, marriage does do that, doesn't it? And death too, of course. This is really interesting because marriage is presented as a sort of death here, in terms of upheaval, of impact on other people, but perhaps also on the individual, on herself, on the woman who's going to be married, a sort of death of her very self. And Wilmot replies, but not birth. No, people seem to come more quietly into the world. It isn't until they've really become personalities that they make changes and upheavals. And this is really how Wilmot has perceived people so far, how she perceives them. She struggles with them being personalities, and any changes in their lives are upheavals to her. So when she realizes that Sybil and Professor Root are a couple and are going to be married, when she realizes that Piers and Keith are a couple, when she realizes that Mary and Marius are going to be married, which is quite a nice tongue breaker as well, she has to take a step back and restructure her conception of life, of the world. It seemed as if life had been going on around me without my knowing it, she muses, realizing that life is not a concept anymore with her at the center, but it is a space that she's outside of looking in. It had never occurred to me that Sybil and Professor Root would want the house to themselves, for example, she says. And this impacts her too. This is not just a change in their lives, it also changes her life. She's forced to move house, and that is the first real change she experiences in those 15 years of being a wife. And although her life may not change, although she is not making any changes, others can and will, and there is no point anymore in basing her self-worth in the inferiority of others, when those poor souls may surpass her in happiness at any moment. Again, this forces her to take a step back and reassess her life for what it really is, but it also allows her to make her life worthwhile in a way that really suits her, that in a way that does not need comparison. And what Rosefield says is that Pym is not a romantic writer, but she is a cautiously hopeful one. She does not want her characters to suffer any more than necessary. And what is left in Wilmot's life then is herself, and Rodney, and that is something that she has to work with. And Pym, of course, is no proponent of marriage. She has deconstructed marriage for the entire length of the novel, but Wilmot is married, and not entirely unhappily so. Rodney is a nice man, and there is real partnership to be found in her and Rodney's relationship, which is really what all of Pym's characters want out of life. I have to say, I have never been a great fan of the novel's ending. It seems a little too limp and too saccharine for such an ambiguous novel, for such an ambiguous story, but I still like how Pym ties up loose ends in a way. Ackley says that the problem in Pym's world is that there are no good men, and relationships with other women are often unsatisfactory, facts which Pym's heroines have learned to adjust to. And I would agree on this in terms of Excellent Women, for example, or Some Tame Gazelle. But I would not agree that this is the case for A Glass of Blessings. Because here, relationships and friendships are active work. Wilmot builds friendships and she reaps the rewards of actively putting in work to build something that is worthwhile with other people. For example, look at the relationship between her and Mary. She takes pity on Mary at first. She helps her go shopping. She entertains her in a way. And by the end of the novel, Wilmot has really humbled herself and respects Mary, not just because she is married, but because she has also got rid of some of her arrogance and respects Mary's existence and who she is as a person, whereas Mildred really gets infatuated with people, but does not really put the work in to build a relationship that is long-lasting, and she rejects the friendship of people who may provide great comfort to her, such as Winifred. And again, there are good men in A Glass of Blessings. Keith is a good man. Piers is an alright man, but Rodney is also a good man, and there is some hope here for a functioning relationship. Wilmot, by the end of the novel, is satisfied, and she has grown. She's genuinely happy for Mary and Marius and able to maintain a close friendship with them. And the book ends with her looking forward to dinner with her and Rodney and Sybil and her husband. And I have to say, most enjoy her cameo in No Fond Return of Love, in which her and Rodney are shown taking a couple's holiday with Pierce and Keith, which is not only quite progressive for 1963, but it's also another wonderful moment that shows how much Wilmot has grown, how she genuinely likes Keith as a friend, which is something that she does struggle with at the beginning. And she has really come to like him, to appreciate him for what he is, not in terms of what he can offer her. And most strikingly, she does not hate him or resent him as a reminder of Pierce's personhood, of Pierce's lack of availability to her. A Glass of Blessings, then, is about the same question as Pym's stories about unmarried women at the core. It is about conformity, about happiness. Pym's single characters suffer from the loneliness and alienation that come with being unmarried, with nonconformity, but marriage does not offer fulfillment either. Wilmot is unfulfilled, as is Jane Cleveland, as is David Lean's Laura Jessen, or Terence Rattigan's Hester Collier. She is a married spinster and experiences many of the same feelings of loneliness, of alienation. Marriage, that marker of conformity and purported source of companionship, is not that. It is a construct that creates shame in those women who live outside it, and it creates boredom and aimlessness in those who have entered it because their husbands are lacking as partners, because society offers no goals or perspectives to married women, because being a wife is a performance that does not respect what the individual married woman wants out of life. It is a state that is hard to exit, since a divorce in England can only be petitioned for on the basis of certain grounds. An affair, then, is a temporary distraction from this aimless kind of existence, offering excitement and the illusion of a life where partnership is not performative, where it is equal. But although this may seem hopeless, Pym, again, is cautiously hopeful. She suggests a solution, and the solution is not the division of labour and roles. It is not the gulf between the sexes. It is not submissive devotion to a husband that makes a wife happy. When Laura Jessen finally breaks down in the arms of her husband, who is so eager to help and comfort her, and when Wilmot and Rodney burst out laughing after confessing to having looked at other people, as they put it, it becomes clear then that the path to happiness, to not feeling useless, unloved, or unlovable, is not paved with rigid adherence to differences, to the gender divide, to roles, but it is paved with openness and honesty, with friendship and affection, and with equality between people who have vowed to share their lives together.